We're going to be discussing Superfund sites, but what is a Superfund site? They're locations where various companies had toxic waste dumped until the EPA stepped in and established a trust fund or Superfund to clean them up. There are multiple of these sites in Indiana, such as one in Franklin, Gary, Lafayette, and the one that we'll be focused on, which is in Seymour, Indiana. Superfund sites like the one in Seymour may be deemed cleaned, but toxic waste cannot be cleaned up easily. The EPA has limited funding for cleanup, even though sites have serious adverse health effects on locals. These locals might not even be aware of the extent of the contamination. Consequences of waste dumping are then often pushed onto lower classes. Seymour's site was created when Seymour Recycling allowed companies that had chemical waste with nowhere to dispose of it dump it on their land. Much of the waste was burned, causing its own issues with air quality, but what wasn't burned was placed in metal drums and buried underground. Locals then started noticing changes in their well water and ill cattle and began writing letters, which when I went to the Jackson County Public Library, they could not find those, which totally fine. They helped me a lot. And the locals rallied for change. The EPA then deemed Seymour Recycling a Superfund site. Cleanup started in 1981. There were reportedly 50,000 barrels of waste. The EPA removed most of the barrels, drew out toxic water over time, connected most local homes to city water instead of relying on contaminated well water, and removed 12 inches of topsoil, according to the EPA's website with information about Seymour Recycling. Although the cleaning was considered finished, they continued monitoring the site in case of leaching. Additionally, they used a pump to flush out toxic water. I could not find in records anywhere where this contaminated water was stored. The pump and treat system that was put into place was shut down in 2022. Because Seymour Recycling is considered done, the monitors that were used to alert of leaching are no longer used. They sit in the field, rather overgrown and unkept. The actual site is fenced off from the public. As mentioned before, Seymour residents experience toxic well water and sick cows. These are highly important issues on their own, but what has been at the forefront of advocates' minds are the overall health effects of these sites. Locals consume the contaminated water, crops, air, and are around these chemicals with no proper protection. The specific health issues largely depend on the type of chemicals or heavy metals dumped there, but common issues from toxic waste dumping are cancer, birth defects, reproductive harm, respiratory issues, and according to National Geographic, quote, the CHEJ points to a recently released study showing a greater rate of autism in students attending schools built 16 to 32 kilometers, 10 to 20 miles from Superfund sites, end quote. There's no official information that has been released about the exact health effects of the Seymour site, but an article printed in the New York Times in 1983 has an interview with a Seymour local, Dan Eggersman, where he stated, quote, in 1978, I could sit in my living room and watch TV, and the smoke was so bad you could hardly breathe. End quote. Here he's referencing when they would burn the toxic material. Events like these, without a doubt, had negative health effects on the locals. Depending on the waste dumped, ARGs or antibiotic resistance genes can be present. They often occur within industrial and agricultural waste. According to an academic article titled Long Lasting Effect of Mercury Contamination on the Soil Microbiota and its Co-Selection of Antibiotic Resistance, ARGs typically contain mercury, quote, a highly toxic metal, which has no known biological functions and causes disruption in environmental health even at very low concentrations, end quote. ARGs, as stated in the title of the academic article, are long-lasting and take an extremely long time to leave the polluted area. Waste like this continues to have an impact on community members nearby. Seymour Recycling contained industrial waste, so it is highly likely that mercury was present. Many times, companies are more willing to dump this waste in low-income areas because there will be less pushback. The residents often don't have the time or resources to take legal action. An academic article discussing Robert D. Bullard's Dumping in Dixie points out that, quote, racial minorities in the lower income classes within the sacrifice zone bear a disproportionate burden of the region's environmental problems, end quote. The mentioned sacrifice zone is in reference to the areas in the U.S. that are deemed okay to dump toxic waste. Low income areas are the targets of these corporations with waste that needs to be disposed of. Although racial issues aren't really prevalent in the Seymour recycling site, class absolutely is. This affects farmers, who are often middle to low class. Seymour recycling site is directly next to a field where crops are grown. Most people in the area lived off of well water and were everyday middle to low class families who did not have the means to combat large companies. Only by working together did they get enough support to get the EPA involved, but when funding ran dry, they didn't have the means to have a strong continued cleanup. National Geographic's article about Superfund sites has a quote from Mick Hans, a spokesperson for the EPA Region 5, and he says, quote, "The EPA finds the PRPs about 70% of the time and makes them pay for site cleanup," end quote. PRPs are those responsible for the site or those involved with the site in any way. So the more PRPs that are caught, the less money out of the Superfund needs to be used. Originally, the law said that if those responsible for the waste couldn't be found, the trust fund itself would pay for it using taxes off of the hazardous materials on the market. This includes things like petroleum and common cleaners. However, in 1995, that law was repealed, and according to National Geographic, the Superfund went bankrupt in 2003. These issues continue to impact people who live nearby. This could be you or someone you know. Because these companies target middle to low class communities, it can be hard to make change alone. By sticking by these affected communities, you can make a difference. Everyday people need to hold these companies accountable. If you know of an unregistered site or even suspect one, call 1-800-424-8802. There's also a form you can fill out at epa.gov/tips. Advocate for these citizens if you suspect something and bring awareness to these sites. Superfund sites never just go away. They continue to affect the environment and entire towns by creating toxic water, crops, and air, causing illnesses in animals, and having adverse health effects on humans. These issues are often pushed onto lower to middle class areas, so be an advocate and never be afraid to call out a corporation. Seymour has discussed installing solar panels in the surrounding farmland, according to the Tribune article from 2020. Nothing has come of this yet, but only time will tell what lies in store for this clean Superfund site. Thank you so much for watching.